Welcome to A Seat at the Table, conversations about bold leadership, equity, and innovation. Hi, I'm Lynette Fraga, CEO of Child Care Aware of America, the nation's leading voice on child care. Throughout this awesome series, we discuss the essential role of our children, our families, our community to catalyze a thriving society. This podcast is focused on what will get us there. I'm talking about bold leadership and real, authentic voices and what it truly means to be a leader, no matter where you sit or what position you hold. We are in extremely challenging times, yet I know there are so many brilliant minds and voices out there that can make this a moment of transformative opportunity and positive change. A moment for ideas and innovation in service to each other. So I wanted to start a conversation with other leaders to hear what has worked for them, how they've driven bold change where they work, and their keys to unlocking better leadership. So I'm so excited for today's conversation to speak with someone I have such deep respect for. So today, my guest is Dr. Renee Boynton-Jarrett. Renee is an associate professor of pediatrics at Boston University's School of Medicine. As a pediatrician and social epidemiologist, she founded the Vital Village Community Engagement Network. Her work focuses on the role of early life adversities as life course social determinants of health. Specifically, she has studied the intersection of community violence, intimate partner violence, and child abuse and neglect, and neighborhood characteristics that influence these patterns. Her current work is developing community-based strategies to promote child well-being and reduce child maltreatment using a collective impact approach in 3 Boston neighborhoods. Wow, Renee, that's a lot and pretty intense. Welcome.
Thank you so very much.
Are you doing okay today, Renee? We're so glad you're with us.
I'm honored to be here. So excited to have this conversation. Looking forward to it.
Terrific. Thanks, Renee. So let's get right into it. So since this is our first episode, inaugural of A Seat at the Table, let me tell you a little bit about the title and why I chose it. So several years ago, I read this quote: "If they don't give you a seat at the table, bring in a folding chair." It spoke to me so powerfully. I think so many can relate. Sometimes it's so hard to be heard and seen, and sometimes you can't even get a seat at the table, let alone get in the room. So as an advocate for children and families, we need to be in the room and at the table, of course, as I know you are. And as a woman myself, and as a Latina, and as a single mom for so many years, and as a human, the idea of bringing in a folding chair when your critical voice is left out, just wow, just loved it. So that's why I named it A Seat at the Table. And fun footnote, Ms. Chisholm was the first Black and female US presidential candidate, if you can believe it, almost 50 years ago. And you know what I also love is that Shirley Chisholm started her professional career as an early educator. So she was actually a director of 2 different childcare centers, just like I was a director as well, in New York. And we can see that, of course, that experience for her influenced much of her policy work when she served in Congress. So just a little fun side note. So with Shirley as an inspiration, let's get it started. So Renee, can you talk a little bit about your professional journey? What and who inspired you and why?
Well, Lynette, I just have to say, I love the title, A Seat at the Table. I love the inspiration drawn from the incredible Miss Shirley Chisholm. I feel like it is the perfect moment to call in her legacy, and it is a true and powerful inspiration. For me, it is also so interesting that you mentioned that she was an early childhood educator. Although I've never been an early childhood educator myself, through junior high and high school, I was a teacher's aide at the Sunflower Nursery School after after school every day and throughout my summer. So it is no surprise that I ultimately selected pediatrics and do community-focused work across sectors of education, healthcare, public health, and social service, in collaboration with parents and caregivers to promote child well-being. This is a part of who I am. It's a part of my mission and my purpose. And I love the imagery of bringing your own folding chair to the table, because I feel like throughout my life, I have had countless examples of incredible women of color who have, in that very way, made room for their intelligence, made room for their gifts, made room for their wisdom, made room for the compassion, empathy, and strengths that they had to share. There were many people who made room. My very first my first grade teacher, Mrs. Nelson, had a piano in the classroom, and she used to play, and we could dance and sing, and then we'd have to freeze. She was teaching us social emotional regulation. She was teaching us how to express ourselves, express our creativity, but also how to regulate our emotions. She saw promise in me, and she let me know that. A lot of times adults don't see children as humans, as fully formed humans, that you can share ideas with. And it was powerful for me to have an adult speak to me and treat me with dignity as a child. And that inspired confidence in me. So Miss Nelson was one of many teachers that expressed love, compassion, hard work, perseverance, and high expectations. My parents were incredible influences on me in so many ways.
As were mine, as were mine.
on so many levels, I don't know where to begin. My father was a room parent, so that was a little unusual back in the 70s and early 80s. My father passed away when I was 7, but I remember for the years prior to that, he was PTO involved, the room parent sweeping up after the class gatherings, extremely involved. He was a journalist, he's a writer and educator, so his schedule allowed for that, while my mom worked a more traditional 9 to 5. And so that had a very big impression on me, the extent to which he took my work, my life, my experience, and that of my sisters so seriously. How much he cared about education, created a sense that education was a gift, was a palace, was a place for exploration and creativity. And that was a huge motivator for me to pursue education and to really see it as something that I was entitled to.
I love it. I love it. I love it, Renee. I'm sorry I stepped in. Just how inspiring your story is, and the idea that educators and parents were such a huge part of your young life and inspired you to become who you are, who is magnificent and amazing. And that's really what we in early care and education do, right? We create positive, strong relationships with our families that we're engaged with and partnering with, and the children in our care and that we're educating. And I think your story is just such a wonderful visual and vision of what we want for our children, and how important and how transformative that can be is pretty amazing.
That is so true. How transformative it is to truly see and invest in the potential of a child. That's what I felt. That's how I experienced love from my community, was that deep investment in who I could be,
Yes.
appreciating me as I was, but knowing like all of this was there for me. And I can think of my church community and my Sunday school teachers were a part of that as well. My mother is a perfect example of someone who led through her role modeling of behaviors. I never heard her say, I'm tired. I never heard her say, I can't. I never heard her express, she really expressed a village mentality of you always have something to give a neighbor. You always have something to share. It's not related to your financial means or your accolades, but really related to like the generosity of being in shared, connection with other people. She expressed that consistently, and I'm so grateful for that example.
And also just, I mean, the idea that community was such an important part of your life as well is so critical.
Yes.
I mean, again, sort of the
Yes.
three-legged stool, right? So we're
Correct.
looking at our teachers and educators, our parents
Yes.
and our supporters and our cheerleaders,
Yes.
and our community doing the same, really wrapping their arms around us. And how critical that is to, again, go back to a word you used, really amplify and support the dignity of you as a human.
Yes.
And your own stepping into and learning who you are as a person. And that's powerful. That's incredibly powerful,
Yes.
and lays the groundwork as we move forward. I want to turn to,
Can
sorry,
I
go ahead,
share
Renee. Go ahead.
one thing just in
Sure, of
response to what you
course.
said around community? As you know, I have dedicated a lot of my life to understanding childhood adversities, early childhood traumas, chronic and
Yes.
cumulative traumas, and the role that neighborhood and community can play as a buffer and a resilience factor. And
Right.
this doesn't come from nowhere. As I mentioned, my father passed away when I was 7, so I was a third grader. My teacher, Miss Banal, baked a huge birthday cake when I returned to class. He passed away about 3 days before my birthday. And when I returned to school, she had a huge cake waiting for me, and they had a party and invited my mom and my sisters to come. My church community came and was very much a presence. We were surrounded by many of my teachers came to my father's funeral, and they were there and held our hands. And I just want to provide that window into what can make a stressful experience more manageable for a child is really consistent, loving, supportive caregiving that really extends beyond the grasp of just the primary caregivers themselves. So I know from personal experience how important it is for us as a society to cultivate and appreciate what communities have done all along, which is
Right.
really bring that village forward to support the potential and the best for each child.
Oh, I love that, Renee. I really do. And I often hear from educators and others who are in service to children and families and communities that have experienced trauma, or their children have experienced trauma, and they're not quite sure if they're armed with the tools to be able to be responsive. And what I'm hearing is we start with the tools we already have, which is
Absolutely.
compassion and
Mhm.
empathy, and focus on the beauty of the individual humans that are younger and can be supported through these really fabulous relationships. Thank you, Renee, for sharing such a personal story and such an inspiration for so many out there as well. So thank you for sharing that, Renee. I circled a point that you made in your comments too, which was making room.
Mhm.
This idea
Mhm.
of making room for leaders and making room for others to come to the table. And I would love to just take a step back and ask, because So often as leaders, we know that part of the work is to inspire future leaders, right? And so I know I hold this very near and dear to my own heart, how incredibly important it is for us to provide, no matter the age, right? young and old, to really inspire those that want to step into leadership roles. So what does that look like for you? How is that inspiration made for you? And how do you invite others to step into leadership?
I'm so glad you asked that question. And so what I can just share very transparently, I would be lying if I said, even as I sit in this conversation with you, I don't feel a sense of imposter syndrome. Am I really a leader? Do I deserve to be here? Has that question been here in my mind? So I just can only say transparently, this might not be everyone's experience, but for me, if that question got bigger and bigger and bigger, I would have gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. And so it is a tension that I manage. And part of how I manage it actually is taking inspiration from younger people. So I love to mentor. I love to work in mentorship roles that allow me to support the pathways of those who will go on to kind of help build a better world. And that is a way that I deal with imposter syndrome, is accepting my responsibility that as an adult and as a member of this society, and given the privileges I've been afforded through education and support and everything that others have poured into me, a lot is expected. So there is a saying, to whom much is given, much is expected. And I very much have to bring that into focus whenever I'm feeling imposter syndrome, whenever I'm feeling a lack of confidence. I have to remember that there are true expectations, and we have a collective responsibility to support, to mentor, and to create pathways for leadership. I sometimes think about my grandmothers. They were both seamstresses. My mother is from Jamaica, West Indies, and her mom was a seamstress. And my father was from Harlem, New York, and his mom was a seamstress at Macy's for many years. And I think about myself as someone who studied science and became a pediatrician. And then I think about my grandmothers who never used a pattern for creating garments of clothing, right? So they were mathematicians. They could visualize complex things in their heads. They probably could have been surgeons if offered the opportunity. But that, stitching, cutting, being able to visualize 3D dimensions in your mind, a lot of skills that surgeons have. So
yeah, I was just thinking to myself, those cuts and
the cuts and the stitching and
for ourselves, our children.
Exactly. So we have to. So when going got rough for me with medical school exams and pressures and other things, I just thought about what they had to do in order for me to have this opportunity, right? And that to me is really important, and I kind of bring that forward. So it can be hard with institutional racism. It can be hard with sexism. It can be hard if you feel as though you are not getting afforded opportunities in an equitable way, or that your work or your offerings are being overlooked or even co-opted, and you're not getting recognized or credited for the work. So that can be extremely difficult and frustrating. And I'm not suggesting at all that we shouldn't address that. I definitely think, like, within your realm of authority and control, and to speak truth to power, address those things. But the microaggressions can be exhausting. And so one thing I think about when I think about the microaggressions is I think about all of the very direct aggressions that generations ahead faced, so that I face microaggressions. And then I think about like, what is it that I want for my granddaughter? What is it that I want for generations forward? I mean, it can be hard. I mean, we are existing in a country where children were taken from their parents and locked in cages. And I don't know what I will say to my grandchildren about what I did and if I did enough. We have an American tradition around family separations. So in many ways, subconsciously, on some level, all of us were not maybe shocked, appalled, all of those things, yes, but there's also like a standing tradition of separation of women of color from their children, fathers of color from their children. If we look at our incarceration system, if we think about slavery, we think about Native American communities, Japanese communities, all of these different points in history, we have examples. And so in recent times, you know, as someone who is viewed as a leader, I also hold myself accountable for what I failed to do, with a deep understanding of trauma and parent-child attachment and exactly what's at stake in the earliest years, months, days of life. I am sickened as much as, so I think leadership comes with all of that. It comes with the willingness to take responsibility and accountability for failures of leadership as much as it comes with the accolades.
So powerful, Renee, so incredibly powerful. And I wonder about, you know, you mentioned separation of children at the border, for example, as an example of some recent really tough and traumatic experiences that so many children and families are still experiencing. What are you seeing now that concerns you about how we as women of color, as humans, as individuals are facing, and how do you see that impacting, to your point, generations to come? And are there actions that we should really be taking as we move forward that you're really thinking about in your own circle of influence?
So I think that we have this interesting paradox right now. We've probably never had more conversation about early care and education as at a crisis point, looking at infrastructure, and as we have during this COVID-19 pandemic. So we have high profile, lots of conversations happening. And we also have a great degree of complacency about the impact on women across the board, particularly women of color. So whether it is the mother who is managing remote work and homeschool and care for an infant or toddler, whether it is the early child care provider or educator who is facing their business closing, their small business closing, you know, that they've probably invested so much heart, soul, and finances into. Again, we have to look at the historical perspective that creates the numbness, right? How have we ever valued the dignity of those working in early care and education? We have a long historical tradition of first this being done by slaves and indentured servants, right? For zero pay. And, you know, and not really ever addressing the form in which it emerged over time, right? And the absence of a true infrastructure that would support something as simple as healthcare access for women and other professionals within this field. We can say it's 2021 and, is sexism really still here? And is racism still really operating in these ways? And I think the strongest thing we can do now is really not rely on our feelings, not rely on something motivating us to feel terribly. So George Floyd's murder motivated many of us to feel terribly. We cannot solve structural racism by relying on our feelings. We actually have to have policies and practices in place that help all of us who have grown up in a race conscious, gender conscious society that creates a lot of blinders around the ways in which we fail to treat each other equally. We also really have to talk about power, right? Like the childcare infrastructure is how it is, not just because someone didn't want to give healthcare, right? or equitably pay those who are caring for our children. There is an advantage that is occurring somewhere in this situation that is disadvantaging some and advantaging others. And when we can start to name that, we can start to name racism within a policy. We can start to name sexism within a policy. And it can help us not operate in reaction to our feelings, but it can help us operate actually in a very structured, systematic, rational way of changing a policy that is causing harm. And so I think that we need to do more of that. We need more accountability. I think about it as air traffic control, right? So in order for a plane to fly, there's air traffic control, there's a series of checks that have to happen before the plane can take off. And we do that, and for planes that take off and crash, if we had a jumbo jet that crashed every single day, we'd stop flying jumbo jets, right? And we would revise our air traffic control system and our checks and our balances. We would do everything. But when we think about what's happened during the pandemic and the degree of disparities in the financial, the individual, the human losses, the emotional losses, it is equivalent to a major crash happening every day. If you look at differences in how Latinx and African American and Native American communities are being impacted versus others. So what system would allow us not to have to watch on television the jumbo jet crash, right? Like what system and its policies, right? And its practices. That would be the only thing that could possibly change this outcome, because our emotional responses, become very difficult for us to get our head around when it's happening at such a large population scope. Who can, in their mind, conceptualize what it means for millions of lives to be lost, for millions, for thousands of childcare centers to close? We can't really conceptualize that in our mind, but you know what it feels like for the one across the street to close. So the only way we can address these systemic injustices is through a systemic policy structure, kind of like an air traffic control checklist that is a requirement, right? You can't proceed without passing through this requirement.
Well, Renee, that was an excellent, what a great analogy. I completely can relate to the idea of the necessary structures and policies that have to be in place. And we at Child Care Aware of America, as you know, are absolutely raising our voices in the stories about the childcare provider across the street, right, that closes. And I think that those narratives have to be told and demonstrated to relate to policy change. That's what we're trying to affect, is policy and systemic change. And we are so honored to have you as not only a board member at Child Care Aware of America, but also as our vice president at Child Care Aware of America. And as a board member, you also are a co-chair on our public health task force. And you are also a pediatrician. And you also run and co-founded Vital Villages. And I just would love to hear about how this past year has been for you and your work on all of these fronts, and a little bit more about the kinds of work and the focus that you've had to have in these various roles, given the pandemic, its disparities, its disproportionate impact on, and we've named many, women of color, early care and education providers, communities of color, indigenous populations. These disparities are part of your work. And by the way, another little footnote, you're also a social epidemiologist, I know. So, so how are you viewing this? And what do you think is important for us to focus on in the weeks ahead?
I think the best response to this is I have three amazing children. All have their own unique and special needs. I have a high schooler, a junior high schooler, and an elementary schooler who all
Wow.
in the pandemic, home instruction. And so what I would have to say is there are two pieces. So I think across everything, I've relied on friends and family and support very, very deeply. And even if there's physical distance, there, efforts to have the emotional support that is needed is really important. To know that, I can't be all things for three kids with very, very different needs, going through very different experiences. So I've always felt like there was a village of teachers and special educators and mental health supports that have been really wonderful for my children thriving. And I think, we just have to be a little more honest about that narrative. Like, it isn't me magically kind of doing a variety of things. In Vital Village, in our community work, it is really collective leadership, distributed leadership that is shared. And a lot of the work we do has been strongly led by members of the community who've been heavily affected by the pandemic, but felt the need to make sure they were reaching their neighbors, to make sure they're reaching new parents, to make sure children are getting the strongest start possible. So I can't really take credit for their work. I feel like I am a part of a team. And the work that I've had the privilege of doing with Child Care Aware of America is also collaborative. The public health task force, everyone has brought their stones of wisdom to the pile. There's a lot of wonderful collaboration with the staff and my co-chair, but it really is just creating a space for people to share wisdom. And then, Child Care Aware of America has just done such a wonderful job of being there, being there for many who have felt that there's no one who's really paying attention to them or noticing them or seeing, their pain or challenges or struggles. So I think that's the really big story, right? The really big story is that one of the things that I think is so important for everyone to do is to appreciate that leadership can be collective, and that there isn't just one model of leadership, but that the more you can kind of be surrounded by strength. And even when I think about my children, I want to see their strengths, not just kind of a top down, I'm the parent and I know, you're the child and you don't know. Actually, during this pandemic, I didn't have many answers for many things, and they had a better idea of how they were feeling and what their needs were than I did. So there's a lot of that, like, developing together, right? And
Yeah, I
so
love that. I
how do
love
we
that. I have to.
invite that into leadership, that idea that we can develop together and that you don't have to be the authority somehow?
So I share this story sometimes when I was a single mom and I was trying to juggle all of these things. I sat down with my children one day, and I used this many, many times since, when I shared with them, like, we're in this together. So this is the first day I've ever been a mom to a 7-year-old and a 3-year-old. So, like, we're in this together. So definitely can understand. I use that to this day and probably will for the rest of my life. These aren't experiences I've had yet, so I'm still learning, for sure.
So
I'd love for you to dig a little deeper, Renee, into this idea you've raised with us around collective and distributive leadership. How do you see that as a different kind of leadership? Like, help us to understand what collective and distributive leadership looks like and feels like, that may be different than the kind of leadership that our listeners either themselves are doing or that they are receiving and seeing.
I think it's so interesting because a lot of times there is the idea that there is a leader or the leader, or, even when we were starting Vital Village work, very, very well-intentioned mentors, said to me, this will never work. People desire a leader to follow. They want kind of the instruction book, and then they can get behind it. This approach can't work. It won't work. But I actually think, and but I grew up in New Jersey. I'm not, I don't have access to, but I think if we just think simply around the world, there are so many rich structures for collective and community leadership. There's so many strong cultural traditions for different forms of leadership. And I think when we were talking earlier and I was talking about the making space, I think that actually is collective leadership that women have been demonstrating in this society for a really long time because of the barriers to accessing other forms of leadership, but we just haven't called it leadership. We haven't identified it as leadership. So when we think about leadership, that's not what we're learning. That's not what we're modeling as leadership. So we might try another leadership structure or model. But I think we inherently know from what we have seen that you often leadership doesn't involve being the one to say the most or talk first or even do anything. Being a leader can be creating a space that allows people to recognize that they have something to offer. And for a lot of the work that we need to do for children in this country, it is really important to have all hands, all hearts, and all minds on deck. So collective and distributed leadership brings people into activation. One thing I learned, when I became a pediatrician, I was deeply interested in preventing child abuse. It's part of why I became a pediatrician. And in pediatrics, by the time you see a child who you're suspecting has child abuse, like comes in maybe with a handprint or something like that, actually, there's been abuse that's been happening for a pretty long time. Maybe it was emotional, other forms of neglect, but you're actually very late. You're never picking it up on day one. There's been a long window. Who picks up child abuse earlier? Teachers. They notice a child that was effervescent is quiet. They notice a change in behavior. They notice if a child feels unsafe. A neighbor, and a neighbor who feels welcome in taking part in being a part of that child's life. So I think that in many respects, the only way to really create a society that protects children from adversities and promotes their well-being is to move beyond our kind of clinical, special training, special certification type of models, and really help each individual acknowledge the role that they have to play. And that includes young adults, that includes adolescents. Older siblings are often very wise in speaking up. So I think that there's, and also our approach to listening to children. Children are often dismissed, what they have to say, what their ideas are. When's the last time a child has been involved in designing their play space? But they probably have a lot to
say.
And a lot to say. And so we have to kind of work on our biases about how we view children and the role they can play, and our biases around how we view members of the community and what they have to offer each other.
Thank you, Renee. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to share, I don't know if I can share it correctly, but a quote by Desmond Tutu that a human is a human through other humans. So in a sense, by connecting with other people, we tap into a deeper level of our own humanity. And I think it's something that's important for us to remember during these times where we're having a lot of difficult conversations with members of our family, with friends, with folks at work. It has been a time where some of us are feeling very exhausted by conversations of trying to define what is racism and what's happening and what does race mean, and all of these things. It really can kind of overwhelm, and sometimes the place to begin is, just being in a place to listen to another person, to connect to another person, really allows us to understand and get to a deeper level of our own humanity. So it's just a part of this human experience.
Great. Wonderful. I love, and I wrote down, and I'm taking tons of notes, by the way, Dr. Renee Boynton-Jarrett, of your brilliance. And one of the things that I wrote down is all hands, hearts, and minds on deck. And I think that is just so important for us all to recognize, is that as we talk about leadership, as we talk about our roles, as we talk about each individual human's role, children and adults alike, we have something to say. And it's going to take all of us in order to prevail as we move through all of these challenges, for sure. And another sort of point that you made also is around the experiences of women in leadership around the table, and how we may, as leaders, have been sort of acting out this collective leadership model and sort of this distributive leadership model, but maybe not being defined as such or being appreciated as critically important to how we move forward and solve problems, right? We're solution generators. And one of the concerns that I've really been tracking a lot over the last months is this really concerning trend of how the pandemic has impacted women, and particularly women of color, but all women. And we've seen how women in the workforce have been really leaving in droves. And not only in the early care and education community and as childcare providers, but as all women across sectors. And that's incredibly concerning for so many reasons. And so I was just curious, as a pediatrician and a community builder and a community supporter, how do you think that early care and education can play or does play a role in making room for, using your terms, making room for women in the workforce? And if we're seeing two things at the same time, childcare and the dissemination and the fracture and the shattering of childcare simultaneously happening with women leaving the workforce, what concerns you about that trend, and how can early care and education and early learning really help to support and buoy this challenge that we see in front of us?
It concerns me because this is it's a shift, and it's a reaction, and it's moving in an opposite direction, right? And so this is it would be, I think the making the decision to leave the workforce to pursue work within the home in a deeper or more fulfilling way is absolutely, so important that everyone has those choices, and many women don't have those choices, right? So the ability to have choice, I think is just so very important. But to see this pattern that is very reactive makes me feel and worry about what are we as a society? Are we in this mode of constantly kind of under supporting, under resourcing, under investing in the earliest years, these short-term strategies that actually have long-term, down the road, significant consequences? So there are significant consequences to our societal productivity, our ability to actually, as a society, be productive, have a well-educated, vibrant, engaged workforce, have adults that will be entering the society prepared, to engage fully as citizens. And the foundation for that is set in childhood. There's a lot of evidence now that shows the return on investment of small, affordable economic investments in early childhood, one of which is really supporting the optimal development of children and making sure parents have the supports that they need, whether it be through early care and education or through a diversity of forms of support. And so I truly am worried that we, not only does this expose how frail the infrastructure and foundation of early care and education was to begin with, meaning that people working within the field were on a razor thin edge already. Childcare and early care and education centers, family childcare and early care and education centers were already closing overnight. We're already having difficulty getting through the certification process. We're already having difficulty having leadership pathways for advanced education and certification for people of color. So we were already on a razor thin edge. Working families that utilize and really need a safe, reliable, consistent place for your child to be. We're already stretched incredibly thin and feeling incredibly alone in their efforts to find childcare. Really long waiting lists. You have to get on the list while you're pregnant. All of these things were already happening with very little compassion and very little societal intervention to improve the circumstances. And if I can say kind of bluntly, what has gotten in the way of greater societal intervention? Nanny state, so, these terminologies around the government becoming someone that is taking away parental rights. I think our mindset around that has been wrong. And I think our mindset and heart set has to be focused on children. Every child gets access to public education, right? At first grade. In the United States, we made a decision that education should be public. We have an unequal education system, but we still have a public education system. Brain development is happening in the most dramatic way in the window of time before public education begins. So our policy does not match what we understand about child neurodevelopment. It doesn't match science. It doesn't match public health, and it doesn't match economics. If a child arrives in first grade, because some states don't have kindergarten available to all, if a child arrives in first grade with learning challenges and differences that have not been supported over that period of time, we've lost so much ground and we'll be trying to play catch up. So I feel as though this is the accident that we all saw coming. We were already existing in a very frail state, but there is a callousness to how devastating and tragic this is right now. And I think that is part of the exit out of the workforce. One, we know more jobs are being cut from women, so there's just higher unemployment happening for women. But I think part of the exit is just, is there any level of societal investment in my well-being or the well-being of my family? And so we as a society, we're called to have our social policies, our programs, our laws, they're supposed to be for social benefit. So I think after a while, you can feel like the mouse fighting with the elephant. And if you're just not being considered, I think that it can just become really devastating and difficult. And I think we will be dealing with the repercussions of this, the mental health repercussions, the emotional health and the physical and financial, economic costs of this. This is not going to be a short-term effect. This is going to have a generational effect. There's going to be a generation of children who will have experienced the harsh consequences of our lack of fully investing in early childhood.
Could not agree more, Renee. And the challenges that we have in shifting the perspectives of our whole national community to pay attention to what we know about the science of early childhood, to ensure that our policies, I love that, policies match what we know about what children, families, and communities need and can benefit from for healthy outcomes for our national society down the road. And we are, I believe, at a very urgent moment as a community of practitioners and stakeholders that want to see the best for our children and families. We are at an urgent moment to raise our voices and to be strong and articulate and clear about what we know, about what we need, and to fully ask for the investments that we are incredibly passionate about and that we know will affect real change and for our children and our families. And that speaks into social justice and racial justice and equity and early childhood and child development. All that we know is true and real for children and families to thrive. And I so appreciate that, that we are called to have our social policies really match that. So thank you for that wisdom. And I am concerned too about the generational effect of the moment, certainly for generations and for generations to come, if we don't get really real and clear about this issue as critically important as we move forward. So I'm going to raise this really clear point as my final question. Let's get really clear. So here's my final question. What advice do you have, Renee, to help to ensure that everyone has a seat at the table? And not only just a seat at the table, truly have equitable decision-making power, a word you used earlier in our conversation, or frankly, even building tables that are missing. How do we create that more equitable system and tackle the systemic injustices that we see in this moment?
It's an incredible question, especially at this moment, as you described, which is truly a crucible moment. If there is anything we have learned from this moment, is exactly as you described, the cost of not advocating for what we know is needed. The costs are tremendous. Costs are tremendous for accepting less, because those under, the structural disadvantage is a huge risk factor that, the COVID-19 pandemic has extremely taken advantage of. So when you ask about making sure everyone has a seat at the table, I think we first really have to look at how are decisions made. Who has decision-making power? And how do we make a more democratic, transparent decision-making processes so that every vote counts, right? And so that everyone can actually participate and is welcomed to participate in helping to make decisions about our union, about the future of our children. I think the second part to everyone having a seat at the table, particularly when it comes to anything affecting children who don't have the ability to vote, who are actually reliant on the adults to make just and fair decisions on their behalf. We have to come to a different foundation. We are living and existing in a society of nuclear families, and it's hurting us all. So if we made the decision to make sure every child's basic needs were taken care of, and we held our society accountable for that, this is something that absolutely could be accomplished if we worked together, and if we were all allowed, if we weren't in any way being suppressed of being able to participate in just democratic processes. So I think that there's the mindset issue around collective responsibility for every child, not just my child's special play group and the children in my family and the children that quote unquote, who are we responsible for? Who do we as a society have responsibility for? Who do we take responsibility for? It really should be all children. If we made that decision from a mindset perspective, then our policies would look very different. And then I think the second piece is really interrogating who is making decisions and who is not having access to decision-making power. How do we wedge that and keep wedging that so we truly have a democracy, and are really living within a democracy?
Renee, Dr. Renee Boynton-Jarrett and her brilliance and her brilliant space of leadership and support, collective leadership. Wow. Thank you so very much. I love your response around mindset and interrogating. Let's get this right. We know so much, and we need to move forward on these issues in service to our children, our families, and our community. And thank you so, so very much, Renee, for being my very first guest on this new podcast. So that is it for this episode. Thank you for joining me for this 10-part series, A Seat at the Table. You can subscribe to A Seat at the Table with Lynette Fraga on iTunes or wherever you stream. Visit www.childcareaware.org, the table, to learn more. So join us next time at the table, pull up a folding chair, and we'll see you then.
Thank you so much for having me.
This podcast is hosted by Lynette M. Fraga, CEO of Child Care Aware of America. This show was produced by Meg Bialis and edited by Liz Twilley. You can subscribe to A Seat at the Table, Conversations on Leadership, Equity, and Innovation on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. A Seat at the Table is a production of Child Care Aware of America, the nation's leading voice on child care. Learn more at childcareaware.org/the table.